Tonight belongs to our 3 Water UCI Fellows who are going to talk about their research, and I will introduce all 3 of them in just a moment. I want to say first of all that this is our first class of research fellows who have gone through our program, who are doing some really interesting research, as you're going to hear, and very diverse, very varied research, geographically, temporally, and certainly in terms of problem area, all related to water. First up will be Nataly Escobedo Garcia, who is a first-year PhD student in the General Social Ecology PhD program in the School of Social Ecology. Nataly's presentation will look at the adoption of water as a human right, both a global scale and in California, focusing on the implicit and explicit issues that arise when defining, constructing, and adopting a human right. Secondly will be Josh Cafferty, who's a first-year PhD student in sociology. His study is analyzing how social factors and water policies function within the context of the specific demographics and locations for water districts during our most recent drought here in California, and the restrictions which were placed on water use between 2014 and last year, 2017. Last but not least, Natasha, Ajay, Kaushal, who is a 4th-year undergraduate, dual major, public health and political science. She'll be graduating this June. And her study, which was a series of questions asked of participants in English, Arabic, and Hebrew, looked at participants living in Israel or the Palestinian territories to discuss their water access and perceived water quality in order to better understand the relationship between residential location and prevalence of waterborne disease rates through an online survey. Very exciting.
A recent World Health Organization study on diarrhea shows that every 3.5 seconds in the developing world, a child dies of waterborne diseases. This was a closing remark made by Bolivian UN Ambassador Pablo Solo on July 28, 2010, to the UN General Assembly. When he finished his remarks, the Assembly would go on to overwhelmingly vote to adopt the human right to water. While I'm happy to report that the death rate is no longer every 3.5 seconds, the death rate is still outrageously high for a death caused by deprivation of the most fundamental requirement for survival, health, and dignity: water. Good evening, everyone. As Dr. Feldman said, my name is Nataly Escobedo Garcia. I'm a first-year graduate student in the Social Ecology Core program, and today I'm here to discuss water as a human right. This presentation looks at the adoption of it on both the global scale and in California, focusing on implicit and explicit issues that arise when defining, constructing, and adopting a human right. As mentioned, the human right to water and sanitation was recognized as a human right by the United Nations General Assembly on July 28, 2010. Along with establishing a definition for this right, the UN Human Rights Council additionally affirmed that the rights to water and sanitation were to be part of existing international law and confirmed that these rights are legally binding upon states. However, getting to this point was complicated, and its adoption history very well reflects the debates that arise when trying to define, construct, and adopt this right. The human right to water was first introduced as part of the Mar del Plata UN Water Conference, where it was declared that all peoples, whatever their stage of development and social and economic conditions, have the right to have access to drinking water in quantities and of quality equal to their basic needs. This declaration, while important, did not serve much effect in actually establishing this right. For decades, the right went through a few different conventions of the UN before making it to the General Assembly. In 1979, the issue was taken up by the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, where water was linked to women's right to enjoy adequate living conditions, particularly in relation to housing, sanitation, electricity and water supply, transportation, and communications. In 1989, this issue was taken up by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, who linked children's right to the provision of adequate nutritious foods and clean drinking water. Finally, in 2006, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities ensured equal access by persons with disabilities to clean water services. Seeing how this right moved through various UN bodies before it was adopted by the General Assembly highlights a very important debate within the adoption of this right. Whether the human right to water was implicit within the human rights framework or if it needed to be explicitly stated. Adopting this right took the UN longer than it should have, partially because the right was treated as an implicit rather than explicit part of the human rights framework, one that was embedded in other international recognized rights, such as right to life or the right to health. This issue, in combination with pushback from powerful corporations and governments who prefer to view water as a private commodity to put on the open market for sale rather than a right, heavily impeded its adoption by the UN. Similar to the issue of implicit versus explicit adoption of this right is the debate over whether the water is a need or a right. A large critique of the resolution coming from these various UN conferences and forums is that these spaces went back and forth between treating the issue of access to water as a basic need and as a right, but made no attempt to define either term or to distinguish them from one another. This is important to point out because the term need implies some sense of charity and represents the recipients as passive beneficiaries, whereas right conveys a sense of legal entitlement, which should in turn result in corresponding duty by an entity such as the state. While there is no debate that water is a human need, the UN resolution did not give a definitive answer to whether water is in fact a right, largely because of its inability to enforce it. In the absence of an international body that can enforce this right, reliance on national courts has been the only method through which this right has been upheld. Countries like Ecuador, Kenya, Nicaragua, South Africa, Uganda, and Uruguay acknowledge this right by explicitly adopting it in their constitutions, while other countries such as New Zealand and India uphold this right in the courts while not explicitly adopting the right in law. Here in the United States, the human right to water is not explicitly acknowledged, and the US was actually one of the countries that abstained from voting at the General Assembly for the human right to water resolution. This country has a legal system that is not conducive to a human rights framework. Water is not treated as a right here, and this is especially true for communities of color. The prime example of this being Flint, where they still don't have clean water, with 12,000 of their residents still reporting lead in their water and galvanized service lines that need to be replaced. Similarly, we have Puerto Rico, whose water systems had the worst record under the Safe Water Act, with 70% of their people living with water that violated standards set by US law. And this is before Hurricane Maria. Water conditions are much worse now. Adopting a human right to water was a difficult task for the UN and has yet to become a reality at the federal level in this country. So understandably, when California decided to take on this task, similar to the UN, many questions about its purpose arose. California's first attempt to establish a human right to water was in October of 2009, just as the state was entering our most recent drought. And in a surprising turn of events, California was actually able to successfully adopt the right with the passing of AB 1242. That was overwhelmingly supported, as can be seen by all the A's. Unfortunately, this victory was extremely short-lived, and within hours of its passing, the then Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed the bill. His reasons for doing so, and I quote, "Language of this bill will undoubtedly lead to potentially costly and constant litigation." So in other words, he didn't want to give people a legal tool through which they could force the state to provide them with basic needs for survival. 3 years later, California would take another attempt of adopting this right with AB 685. This time around, however, overwhelming support was no longer the case, most likely due to the fact that the state was now fully in a drought and fights over water allocation were becoming increasingly contentious. For a very long time, spanning back to when colonizers first imposed water rights in this state, water has been treated as a commodity and a property, as opposed to a common resource meant to be shared by all. This argument was made very clear by the opponents of AB 685, who opposed the bill as it would establish a requirement that water agencies provide water service regardless of affordability, insisted this bill may have the effect of preventing water suppliers from cutting off services to customers who fail to pay their bills, and that by establishing a potentially enforceable human right to water, the bill has uncertain legal implications, which may result in litigation. Again, echoing Governor Schwarzenegger's concerns. While the list of opponents may not seem large, close attention needs to be paid to the fact that the Association of California Water Agencies, or ACWA, opposed the bill. ACWA is the largest statewide coalition of public water agencies in the country, with more than 430 public agency members, 2 of which service this area, Irvine Ranch Water District and the Orange County Water District. After a year of compromises and 7 different versions of the bill, AB 685 was passed on September 25, 2012, making California the first state to legally recognize the human right to water. This, of course, was applauded by many, including the UN, but debates over the right did not end with its adoption. AB 685 explicitly requires that relevant state agencies, including the Department of Water Resources, the State Water Resource Control Board, and the State Department of Public Health, employ all reasonable means to implement this right, which included requirements that state agencies revise, adopt, or establish policies, regulations, and grant criteria to implement this right, such as affordability criteria. However, what AB 685 did not do was to expand any state obligation to provide water or require the expenditure of additional resources to develop water infrastructure beyond any obligations that already existed. This point becomes increasingly important because while Californians may have a right to claim water for basic needs, this right does not have any clear clause that addresses whether there is any right to water service, especially when the water service depends on substantial financial investment in infrastructure. Essentially, this right does not establish any legal duty of the state to provide water services. When discussing water rights and allocation, it is important to pay critical attention to issues of power and control. Who has it, who does not, who benefits or loses, in what ways, and to what effects. Here we have polluted land in Calexico in the Imperial Valley. Here we have overwatered grass right by the UCI Medical School. Here we have drought-ridden Lanier out in the San Joaquin Valley. Lush green fields at the Oak Creek Golf Club here in Orange County. Low-income communities of color bear a disproportional brunt for our pollution. It's estimated that there are hundreds of thousands of families in the Central Valley alone, a large percentage of them minority farm workers living below the poverty level, whose household water contains toxins. These farm workers who are entrusted with producing the food that ends up in most of our dinner tables don't have the means to live in communities like ours with access to safer water. As of May of this year, California reported having 269 polluted public water systems. Entire cities are listed, high schools, and elementary schools. And the majority of these systems serve low-income communities of color and farm worker communities. We have approximately 1 million residents in the state that don't have access to clean water. AB 685 asks, but did not require state agencies to consider the human right to water in the creation of water management policy. Clearly, just asking isn't enough. What I have presented to you today is the basis under which I am constructing a discourse policy analysis of AB 685 in an effort to understand what it really means to legally adopt water as a human right and the implication that has for rural farm working communities. Water allocation is a highly political issue reflecting societal power relations, with current priorities often benefiting the well-off and powerful. Human rights, in contrast, require prioritization of the most basic needs of all people, something the United States has had difficulties doing. While I applaud California's efforts in legally acknowledging the right to safe, clean, and affordable and accessible water, it is far from actually being able to provide everyone with this right. I want to thank my advisors, Dr. Dave Feldman and Dr. Susan Bibler-Coutin, for supporting my research, Water UCI for providing me with a platform to share my work, and finally, thank you everyone for your time, and I will now open up the floor for any questions. I personally don't know too much about the case in Puerto Rico, but as a whole in the United States, human rights isn't the largest of conversations because we don't have a legal system that's very conducive to that. That's a difficult question. Water allocation in California is very complicated because for one, there's a lot of fragmentation across the state. Water doesn't just purely come from the state, it also comes from out of state. Issues of infrastructure is another big problem. Funding it, both funding it and actually building it. As of now, the only thing I can really ask is that people be more conscious of their water consumption, hold their representatives accountable for issues they see not only within their communities and other communities, and think a little bit more about the collective good. Well, that's definitely something that's happening. Both Water UCI and a couple of different research centers across the state are looking at different countries and different structures to see if there's better ways of addressing water issues. But equity is always a big concern, and that one, I think, is a more difficult one to tackle. Might be a potential solution, but then you also have issues of, well, how does the state understand what's happening within every small community? At the same time, we've seen that fragmentation actually does impede quite a bit of does impede water equity. There should be some sort of balance between state and local agencies, but at the rate of fragmentation we have right now, that seems like a very difficult step forward. Quite a few have linked up with advocacy agencies, they were the big ones that pushed AB 685. And while, don't get me wrong, AB 685 is a step forward, there was some funding that was made available for communities that found themselves in extreme situations. An emergency water fund was created, but that fund is actually, it's drying out. Right now there's another proposition up, SB 623, which would establish a water fund that would be available on a year-to-year basis. It would become a part of the California budget. So a lot of these communities have really built on their resiliency skills and started advocating for themselves. I just accompanied a community up to Sacramento where they went to lobby for SB 623. So while in a lot of the times these communities aren't necessarily seen as having much of a voice, I've actually seen the opposite where they're really empowering themselves, which is fantastic.
Okay, yeah, my name is Josh Cafferty. I'm a graduate student in the sociology department here and a Water UCI fellow. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my research that relates to water conservation effectiveness through social factors and policies. So kind of looking at the interplay between those two. So first, just because of the setting of this, I wanted to talk a little bit about what environmental sociology is so that you would know where I'm coming from. In terms of what I'm attempting to look at. So the broad definition of environmental sociology is looking at the interaction between societies and their environment. So sociology being the study of societies. Obviously, we know what the word environment means. So it's looking at the interaction that occurs between those two things, and it can go back and forth in a cyclical relationship or one having an effect on the other. So I kind of wanted to just go over a couple of the main areas of environmental sociology. So one is looking at how someone's local environment affects the society or the people that live within that environment. And one of the best areas of environmental sociology that looks at this is environmental racism, which is basically the argument that low-income persons and people of color bear a disproportionate burden of environmental hazards. This is David Nagui-Pello, one of the main people working at Santa Barbara now, who studies these phenomena. And obviously, Natalie touched on a lot of this. Whenever we're talking about inequalities, they're typically affecting these groups of people. So that's kind of looking at how the environment plays a role on the individuals, whether we're looking at access to water or we're looking at location of toxic waste dumps or different things along that line. And then kind of going in the other direction, the looking at how social factors play on affecting the environment itself. So it's kind of switching the roles here. We have the rise of what environmentalism is, and that's a big part of what environmental sociology is, because environmentalism is a pretty new concept. Whenever you look at the historical sense of it, it's really come strongly within the last 50 years and probably started about 100 years ago, started gaining ground. So looking at that, some sociologists argue that this comes from a global culture, because we can see that treaties are occurring throughout the world, and some argue not effective, but attempts to make treaties to save or help with different environmental issues. And then another major area of environmental sociology is looking at the metabolic relationship between society and the environment. So that's looking at how we impact the environment and then how the environment impacts us, and it kind of going in that circle. So one of the main arguments of looking at this is done by John Bellamy Foster, who basically argues that there's a metabolic rift. So basically human consumption has gone beyond what the environment can actually provide for humans, and that's why we're starting to see all these impacts with climate change, scarcity in resources, and they argue that this is inevitable through capitalism. So it's kind of that argument of looking at a system within the society and how that's playing a role in the environment. So me personally, I'm looking more at how people react to these types of things happening. So in my research, I'm wanting to look at what leads to successful water conservation. So looking at perhaps we are over-consuming what we're doing right now. So what factors are playing a role in reducing that consumption, especially when it has to deal with water? So this study will be analyzing how both social and demographic factors interact with water conservation efforts by different water districts. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at the California drought restrictions that were enacted from 2014 to 2017. This provides a unique look at all water districts in California making attempts to reduce consumption and see what factors were successful and which were failures within that. So looking at the literature that focuses more on policy and programs, it's been shown that price increases and mandatory restrictions actually play a bigger role than voluntary restrictions whenever we're looking at these issues. So it's important to understand what types of policies are being effective on their own. Additive effects of conservation policies are limited. So basically what this is arguing that once something like mandatory restrictions are in place, adding price increases actually doesn't have that large of an effect. So whenever we're looking at these policies, we want to make sure not only that the policy itself is effective, but within the context of the other policies that are in place, that it's actually going to be beneficial. And the last study here is focusing more on the programs, the outreach programs that water districts do. And this also finds that multiple non-price conservation programs decrease the effectiveness of each program. So this is looking at things like education, public outreach, rebates, all of those different types of programs. The more that each district does, the less effective each one becomes. But one thing that this type of research kind of holds as stagnant or stationary are the social factors that are occurring. So Gonzalez and Ajay took this specifically with the most recent drought that we had. And they looked at through policies, public outreach, and the internet in and of itself play a key role in raising public awareness of water scarcity itself. So they're basically arguing that during times of drought, part of the effect that we're seeing isn't just the policies that water districts are putting into place and those lowering water consumption, but actually the people gaining knowledge about water scarcity and the issues that are occurring, and that playing a role in their habits. One way that they model this in their study is through the rebound phenomenon. So the water rebound is basically the process of where an area will slowly start to consume water after policies are lifted, a drought is finished, something along those lines, and water use will start to continue. A lot of places it goes back to what water levels used to be, but then there are scenarios where it doesn't. So basically they're able to model why that's occurring in some areas, why those new community behaviors are sticking even after the policies no longer exist. And they're also able to show that before policies are enacted, that people are actually beginning to use less water in times of drought, which calls into question this first study, because the reason that they basically posited that this is occurring is because voluntary restrictions were placed first and then mandatory and price increases were put into effect, which then had a 23% reduction. But this doesn't take into account the social impact that people learning about water scarcity can have. So the fact that they put in these restrictions and the price increases later, it could have just been a fact that it was temporally later. And because people were understanding the issues with the drought better, they were actually reducing their water consumption. And then another interesting study that looks at the most recent drought actually looked at the message typologies that water districts were using, and basically looking at their effectiveness on conservation efforts. But what they actually found is whenever water districts purely went with the conservation message, this actually led to a negative impact. So people actually had a negative attitude towards conserving water when this was used by itself. However, whenever they put this with an interaction, so say people saying that we need, not purely just to conserve water because it's something we should do, but because there's a drought or water scarcity, or because it'll save you money, different arguments along those lines, then it does actually have an impact. So it's important to understand those messages that water districts are putting out, because they could actually have the opposite effect that they're looking to have. In my study, I'm going to be using qualitative comparative analysis. I know the method slide is always fun, so I'm going to keep this really brief and just go over a couple definitions that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be talking about causal conditions. And those are just the explanatory variables that might be affecting an outcome. So just think whatever I'm trying to look at to explain why the outcome is occurring. In this case, successful water conservation is the outcome. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about fuzzy membership score. All this is referring to is that let's say if we're looking at the outcome in terms of water conservation, you could have full success or you could have full failure, but a lot of the times there's something in between that where improvements were made, but maybe they didn't hit their goal. So the fuzzy membership score in this type of analysis just allows us to be able to account for that and not just treat it as a success or a failure. Recipe is the most important word, and that's why I'm using QCA specifically for this type of analysis. This looks at the specific combination of causally relevant ingredients linked to an outcome. So basically the way Charles Reagan, who invented this, talks about it is think of the ingredients to a pie. And basically you can't have an apple pie if you take out the ingredient of the apple, even though those other factors might still be there. So the basic argument behind this is you need a minimum recipe to generate an outcome with the causal conditions. Okay, so some of the ones I'm gonna look at. The first one, which I've talked about previously, is demographics. On this front, it's more gonna be focusing on how these might play with the water policies that are being enacted. So the basic argument here is that, let's say an urban area with a very high average income might react differently to water policies that are put in place than a rural, lower average income region. So it's important to look at these different demographic factors to understand where policies are actually going to be effective and where they might not be effective. And then I'm going to look at another causal condition is the water district messages themselves. So getting back to that message typology that they're attempting to employ. One of the ways that I'm going to get at this is using the Wayback Machine. So basically, I have access to all the websites for the water districts. Historically, I have access to all of them. So right now, I can go to I was looking at one earlier, March 24th, 2015, and look at all the links that are available on the website, look at all the page, and see what type of things are trying to do, whether that's programs, whether that's education outreach, different stuff along those lines that's available on the website, as well as contacting the water districts themselves and talking about the types of programs policies and programs that they implemented, which are the next couple of them. On the programs and participation, I really am hoping to get more information on the participation that they had with these different events, whether it's, they had I know Irvine Water District did a program where they were fixing sprinklers, and then you got like a gift card, I think, on Instagram, if you put that you were doing this type of stuff. So looking at attempting to get information about how many people that reached, how many people actually participated in those type of events. Local media generation to understand how salient of an issue the drought was becoming through different stages of this. So as I talked about previously, in the beginning of the drought, it might not have been as salient of an issue for people, but as the drought continued and became longer, it might have been becoming more and more of an issue, and therefore people would be more likely to conserve water, hopefully. And then also just controlling for things like regional climate. Obviously, water use is going to depend on different factors like that. Also looking at, whenever we're talking about demographics, we also have to include how many people have yards in an area. If we have a high density population, there's not as much water being used for landscaping and other issues like that. So for the outcome itself, I'm going to be looking at whether or not water districts were successful in the reduction of urban water use. And what I'm going to be using for this is basically when the drought restrictions were put into place, each water district actually had its own percentage that it had to reduce the amount of use than the previous year in 2013. So I'm going to be looking at that. So then it's very contextual to each community, and then scoring their outcomes and calibrating that fuzzy membership based upon that, based upon how successful they were in that. So kind of the benefits of this, theoretically for sociology, this is very generalizable to other issues whenever we're talking about consumption in general, how people react to scarcity and resources. But then it's also very important whenever we're looking at water districts themselves, because a lot of water districts weren't successful in curbing water consumption. As we know, in California in general, we have a lot of issues with the water supply in general. So it's very important to be able to look at this contextually and understand what's going to be most effective in certain areas, so then we can get those water level consumptions lowered. I want to thank Water UCI and all of you who came out here tonight for listening to me talk. Thank you. America in general, we have a lot of issues with consumption towards that fact that a lot of other countries are a little bit better on. And that really gets back to whenever we're talking about the Gonzalez and Ajay research, whenever they talked about how community behaviors can change after something like this. So when you're in a period of time when you don't have access to something like this, you kind of get those things through your head that you've never thought about before and what you can go without. And then hopefully people learn those types of things, and then it kind of becomes the dominant culture to practice those even whenever we're not in drought. In terms of those things. But there's definitely, when we're looking at it globally as well, there's large disparities in the amount of water that we use versus a lot of other countries, especially countries that don't have access to as much water. And especially California, whenever we're comparing those even to other states, the amount of water that's consumed here is a little bit lower, but not always within proportion of what we have access to, obviously. So I think it's very important to look at those cultural understandings And I think that can play a bigger role sometimes than price increases or other policies that are occurring. So I think it's important to understand how people are learning those things. I wouldn't say that there was consistency throughout it. And I think a lot of people's kind of, cultural understandings or personal beliefs about the issue is what play a big role in the type of messages that they're putting across. So a lot of people kind of pushed it from that idea of we're currently in a drought and there's water scarcity. So like we need to, for a little bit, try to get rid of this. But then other people were trying to push the argument that because our water table levels are going so low and these different things and climate change, we're going to have worse droughts, that this needs to kind of become a way of life as opposed to this issue that we're looking at in terms of just water scarcity at this moment. So I obviously fall more on that side of it, but the research is showing that maybe people don't always agree with that they don't like those conservation issues. So while the messages themselves aren't always consistent, there is evidence that perhaps some of those messages that are maybe rooted out of something that we all don't agree with are having more of an impact than we like to admit.
Thank you for joining me. Good evening. My name is Natasha, and I'll be talking to you today about my research thesis for this past year, which has been water in conflict. Just a little bit of background on how I came to this issue. Water has really impacted my life in two separate ways. So the first one was in 2014 when I was traveling to India with my mom. It was the night before we were going to take off, and it was New Year's Eve, and we'd gone out to celebrate. So I had had some bad street food that night and ended up in the hospital. And I was very lucky because my parents and my family had the financial resources and the connections to get me into a hospital and get me the care that I needed to fly out because my system was very debilitated. And the second instance that I had interacted with water very closely was in 2017. When I was actually traveling in Israel and Palestine, and I was able to witness firsthand the impact of political conflict on water and the impact that it was taking on the people who lived there. So without further ado, I focused on this region for my thesis this year. Basically, I'd like to cover some terminology for you before I jump right in. OPT stands for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, and will refer to the territories outlined in green that you see on the right-hand image. The West Bank and Gaza will be included in this term, the OPT. And IP is just something that I've coined for the purposes of this presentation, just to keep it kind of brief, because the terminology just does get a little bit long. So two wars that largely helped shape the nature and the status of this region are the 1948 war and the 1967 war. The 1948 war ended with largely the definition of this green line that you see that outlines the green area of the West Bank. And the 1967 war also helped establish that kind of boundary as well as the occupying powers. Certain sources of water that are available in this region, as you can see, there's the Mediterranean Sea, there's the Jordan River, there's the Sea of Galilee up there, and then the Dead Sea down south. The Israeli National Water Canal is important to note because it did take water from the Lake Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, which is up in the north, and directed water down through Israel proper, which is the whitish area that you see next to the green areas. It's important to note that because this river, the Jordan River, used to have a flow about 1.3 billion meters, and now it's about 2% of that today. So that, it's kind of reduced the availability of natural water in the region. Another natural water source in the region is groundwater storage. So that is represented in two different large areas known as the coastal aquifer and the inland aquifer. Kind of both right now are being polluted through different toxins as well as industrial waste and runoff, so they're not as available as they would have been. State involvement in water allocation is also important to note. Oslo Accords of 1995 basically established the split of the area of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, which I'm not going to get into because it does get a little bit confusing and convoluted, but it basically divided up the area and created this thing called the Joint Water Committee. And this committee was supposed to be encompassed by representatives from both sides of the government, so the Israeli government as well as the Palestinian government officials. And in 1995, they had set a 5-year interim period to go meet in the year 2000 to reconvene and renegotiate certain water policies. However, that was not the case, and it actually elongated a lot of different approval processes for, say, like if you wanted to build a well and you lived in a certain area, your process was a lot longer than it would have been after Oslo. Moving forward with why water is an issue, as you can see, the WHO mandates that there's about 100 liters per person as a minimum standard, and Palestinians in the West Bank on average have about access to about 37 liters per person per day. So this is lower than the required quantity. An important statistic is that about 31% of West Bank Palestinians are actually connected to a sewerage network. So this means that largely the remaining people who do not have access to proper sewage or proper treatment have more infiltration of their waterbed, their natural waterbed, by their runoff, and are unable to use their wells for lack of proper sanitation. So it's important also to take a look at the current efforts that are going on in the region in terms of water and sanitation. For those of you who know, desalination is basically taking seawater and either boiling it or transforming it through reverse osmosis to become more usable. So water resources as they stand in Israel, Israel now gets about 55% of its domestic water from desalination projects, and larger quantity of available water in the region can supply Gaza's needs as well as the West Bank's needs. But this issue of water is kind of implicated in the political nature of this conflict. Environmental concerns of water in the region are the salinity of the runoff or the waste that kind of gets created from these desalination projects. It gets pumped into different bodies of water and actually starts to increase the toxicity of that area, kind of killing off the wildlife of whatever area that brine might get dumped into because of the high acidity of these solutions. So it's California has also started to look into desalination efforts. It just highlights kind of a new trend in terms of water purification and where we can look for in terms of new water resources. So that's also interesting to note. Just jumping right into the study that I conducted this past year, the reason why I wanted to study it largely was because of the irregular access to potable water, both in quantity and quality of people who lived in the region. I think that there's a disparity between access as well as perceived quality, so I wanted to study more of that. Contaminated water source, as I've mentioned before, chlorides and nitrates are something that kind of infiltrate the natural waterbed of the region, as well as microbial contamination from improper waste in the region. And the effects of this can lead to increased prevalence of waterborne diseases like cholera, hepatitis, and typhoid fever. So some of the study aims, the first aim was to assess how people access water as well as their perceived water quality. And the second aim was to assess access to medical care and whether the residents have been diagnosed with any waterborne disease illnesses. And I hypothesized that their perceived water quality, in terms of quality and access, would be of lower quality and quantity for those living in the occupied Palestinian territories than it would be for the people who lived in Israel proper. And my second hypothesis was that waterborne disease rates would also differ by residence and ethnicity. So you might be asking, how would I conduct a study like this? This is not exactly local water politics. So I actually, when I was traveling in the region with a conflict analysis narrative-based education group, it's called the Olive Tree Initiative, we met with people who kind of make up the different narratives of this conflict, and I was able to get some contacts from them, and I was able to push out my survey through them, as well as through the contacts of the OTI community. So recruitment methods, I largely just recruited anybody who identified as living in Israel or the occupied Palestinian territories, and it was an online survey offered in English, Arabic, and Hebrew, which I had translated, not myself, but I had people who I knew translated into it. Moving forward, this is just an example of certain questions in my study. I asked about certain demographic questions and then moved on to asking about water access and water quality. Obviously, this is not measurable or it was just based on perception is all I'm trying to say. And moving forward, with the water access and water quality, I asked about unpleasant taste and unpleasant odor, as well as how many hours they are able to access water to each day. And the last page of the study was basically asking about access to medical clinic, as well as whether they had been diagnosed with any waterborne diseases by a medical care professional. So I was able to collect about 28 responses over the course of a couple weeks of data collection. This was all done online through Google Survey. So this is kind of the breakdown of the responses in terms of demographics. So as you can see, there was about 46% of the people who identified as Israeli who responded to my survey, and about 39% of the people who identified as Palestinian. About half of them lived in Israel proper. About 29% lived in the occupied Palestinian territories. 21 said not reported, because that was a mishap in my survey where I didn't click the right button to make it required. Just in terms of looking at the survey, who responded to which survey, I had most of my participants responding in English, which could be a potential bias. I mean, it is a potential bias. And hopefully in the future, if I am to conduct more studies like this, I would like to see those numbers more equal. Responses by residence. So as I said, I would break down my responses by residence and then by ethnicity, just to see whether there were any differences. So just taking a look at the chart on the left, perceived water quality by residents, I asked participants of the study to rank their water perception of their quality by scale, just very bad all the way to very good, as you can see. So the blue bar, which represents people who identified living in Israel proper, said that they had more often okay to very good water than did people who identified as living in OPT. Moving on to the right-hand graph, daily water access. This was interesting to take a look at the differences, because based on where you live, whether you access water through your government-provided network can largely determine the quality of water right there. So that was also an interesting finding, just because more people who identified as Israeli or as living in Israel proper said that they had access to more government-regulated water, which is of a better quality than it would have been had they lived in OPT, as is indicated here as well. Moving on to responses by ethnicity, just looking at the same exact questions, but broken down by ethnicity. The responses look similar, but they do vary a little bit. So daily water access by residents differs, but the water quality by ethnicity looks about the same. Waterborne illnesses. So this was kind of the crux of my entire study. I was looking at how waterborne disease illnesses differ, or if they differ at all. So these were the results that we got from the 28 not very representative people of the entire region, of course. 25% of the people said that they identified as Palestinian and had experienced hepatitis A, whereas that was not the case as people who lived in Israel. It's interesting to note that there was a similar pattern in both the region of residence and the ethnicity graphs. So they both exhibited the same pattern. So whether I had broken down this data and stratified it by residence or stratified it by ethnicity, it kind of displayed the same results or the same kind of trends. So sample responses, some things that I got back from the response section of my survey were these quotes from people who lived in the region. We are spoiled and basically have unlimited access and good health. The government takes it very seriously. And moving on, in the summer, there's something in the water in the city of Nablus, and the arrival of water comes late. I live without water for those days or have to buy water at a really high price. So my study is, like most, not without its limitations. Some were the selection bias. I know that the people that I was able to reach out to with this study kind of limited the people who I was able to, it was not going to be a very representative survey of the entire population due to the people who I was able to access. It was a smaller sample size. It was only 28 people, so obviously not representative of a larger population, but it is a good indication that I hope to do more research in the future. And there was a recall bias because as I asked these questions, I started to realize that people may not have a timeline to think about in terms of their water quality. So hopefully in the future, when I do this again, I will make that more clear. Here's some of my references, and I'd like to thank Water UCI for providing me with this opportunity and the funding to help push this survey forward. Public Health for helping me come up with this idea, and the OTI community for taking me on this experiential education trip that kind of shaped this project. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions now. So thank you. That's a great question, and I think it's super important to address the organizations that are doing work on the ground today to alleviate some of these issues. When I was there, I had the privilege to meet with a community or a organization that works in the community called EcoPeace, and they basically do a lot of political advocacy as well as grassroots kind of organization and mobilization between both sides. So I thought that was important because it's necessary to acknowledge that both communities are impacted by water, but to bridge that gap. So that's something that they're doing, and I'm happy to provide you with their information or a website if you'd like. Yeah, but that's just one example, and I know there's plenty who are doing work, really good work. Yeah. It's just, I think they're more on the nonprofit or NGO sector side, so it may not be a total government-sponsored act yet, but we'll see what happens. That's a great question, and in the interest of respecting everybody's time, I'd like to get back to you on that, but I just want to address that largely. The U.S. has had a very close relationship with Israeli politics, not just water politics, but politics in general. So I think that the way that the policies in the region are shaped may mirror what the U.S. is kind of doing with their own communities, as we've heard from of my other fellows, and like in terms of approaching it from not a human rights approach, which is unfortunate, but that's something that we can work towards as a group, hopefully. Yeah. In my future, I do hope to go back to this region and do more work with refugee camps, because there are there's so many refugees who are living within Israel as well as within the West Bank right now, and I know that their water access is very disproportionate. I did have one respondent who lived in a refugee camp. It was called Dehesha Refugee Camp, and they indicated that their water quality is very poor and also not delivered maybe like once a month or twice a month. So it was very drastic. So in my future, I do hope to go back there and conduct more on the ground work and collect data on my own or with an organization, but that is in my future. Okay.
Let's give another hand for all three of our